Every so often people ask me, why are you so down on Intel? So let me explain why. So as usual, we'll start with a history lesson. Intel Corporation was founded on July the 18th, 1968 by semiconductor pioneers Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, who's mostly famous for Moore's Law. Now what a lot of people maybe don't realise is that early on, Intel was a memory manufacturer. And even though Intel had created the world's first commercial microprocessor chip in 1971, that was the Intel 4004, it was not until the success of the personal computer, the PC, that this became its primary business, and this happened around 1981, with the advent of the IBM personal computer, commonly known as the IBM PC. Model number 5150, introduced on the 12th of August 1981. Now the processor in the 5150 was an Intel 8088 running at 4.77 MHz. And yes, that is megahertz, not the gigahertz. But what's interesting here is that in the earlier units, the Intel 8088 used was a 1978 version. Later on was a 78 and 81 and 82 versions of the chip, and then second source AMDs were used after 1983. And here we can see an actual die shot of an AMD 8088, designed by Intel, manufactured by AMD. AMD, or Advanced Micro Devices, was formally incorporated on May 1st, 1969 by Jerry Sanders, along with 7 of his colleagues from Fairchild Semiconductor. And here we can see that the previous year, Robert Noyce had left Fairchild together with Gordon Moore, and of course had founded Intel just under 1 year earlier. Now AMD initially started out as a second source supplier of microchips designed by Fairchild and National Semiconductor. But unlike Intel, AMD were focusing on logic chips, whereas Intel was much more focused on memory. Now this second source supplier thing is basically the same thing as what we saw with the IBM PC and AMD 8088. So AMD had got a license to manufacture Fairchild and National Semiconductor's chips. And the reason for that is that most companies would rather avoid having to rely on a single supplier of a component. Back then in the 70s and 80s, getting a reliable supply of microchips was not that easy. In some cases, yields were very poor, and any kind of mishap could interrupt the supply. So these second source supplier things quite often involved cross-licensing agreements, so that each company would obtain the right to manufacture and sell parts designed by the other company. So what happened was, as we saw, IBM created its PC, the 5150, and they wanted Intel's x86 processors, but only under the condition that Intel also provided a second source. And so Intel and AMD entered into a 10-year technology exchange agreement, which they first signed in October 1981 and formally executed in February 1982. The terms of the agreement were that each company could acquire the right to become a second source manufacturer of semiconductor products developed by the other, and the technical information and licenses needed to make and sell a part would be exchanged for a royalty to the developing company. So Intel would create a CPU and they would basically license the design to AMD. It's kind of similar to what ARM does today, as they design the CPUs which other companies manufacture in exchange for royalty payments. Simply put, what this really ended up with was that AMD became a second source manufacturer of x86, which satisfied IBM's requirement, and in return Intel provided AMD with a database of their designs. However, in 1984, only 2 years after the agreement was formally signed, Intel, in order to shore up its advantage in the marketplace, internally decided to no longer cooperate with AMD in supplying product information, and delayed and eventually refused to convey the technical details of the Intel 80386 to AMD. In 1987, AMD invoked arbitration over the issue, and Intel reacted by cancelling the agreement altogether. After 3 years of testimony, AMD eventually won in arbitration in 1992, but Intel disputed this decision. Another long legal dispute followed, ending in 1994, when the Supreme Court of California sided with the arbitrator and AMD. Now, as you know, 1 or 2 years is a hell of a long time in the technology industry, but in this case, Intel had effectively cancelled the agreement, the 1982 Technology Exchange Agreement, around 1984. But they had to wait until February 1992 before the courts finally found that Intel had breached the contract, and of course Intel appealed that decision, which helped to drag it out even longer. And they actually won in the Court of Appeal, at which point AMD moved it up to the California Supreme Court, where they reversed the earlier judgment of the Court of Appeal. And this was actually a very important victory for AMD, because of the arbitrator's detailed findings of how Intel intentionally violated AMD's rights, and also because it affirmed AMD's intellectual property rights in the highly competitive AM386 processor, or the Intel 80386 processor. Now at this time, Intel were also found guilty of discovery abuse. It's a bit like trying to pervert the course of justice by subtly attempting to harass or obstruct an opponent by giving poor answers or requesting information which has got nothing to do with the actual case. But all of this, of course, served to drag out the case, and between 1982 and 1992, Intel had basically made so much money selling these CPUs to IBM that they had created a monopoly for themselves. Later on in his book, Bill Gates Speaks, we discovered that this was a common tactic employed by Intel. Obviously, Intel and Microsoft were also vying for control of the PC market, and those two had a lot of issues, but Bill Gates said that Intel and their army of lawyers would try all kinds of obstruction and stretch out litigation until effectively it no longer mattered. And these tactics continued. Near the tail end of 1990, Intel countersued AMD over claimed copyright infringement on certain Intel microcode. Almost 2 years later, the jury determined that AMD did not have the right to use Intel microcode. But then almost a year later, the courts grant AMD a new trial, finding that Intel had again committed discovery abuse. And on March 10, 1994, 3.5 years after Intel brought the action, the jury returned the verdict in favour of AMD. And Intel tried with the 386 and also the 486, but these cases became moot because AMD had prevailed in the 287 microcode litigation. But once again, the real damage here was done elsewhere, with AMD effectively being hamstrung in their ability to create CPUs. And in the face of this uncertainty during the legal dispute, AMD were forced to develop clean room design versions of Intel code, as we saw long after Intel had released its own X386 in 1985. AMD finally released their own clone of Intel's 386 processor in March of 1991, and it was a very popular CPU, selling 1 million units in only 6 months. But all of these actions had clearly taken a toll. So by the middle of 1990, they had developed their first in-house x86 processor, known as the K5, and these of course went on to be competition for Intel's famous Pentium processors. But effectively the end result here was Intel had forced AMD out of the second supply agreement, out of any licensing agreements, and into creating their own x86 CPUs. And they were fast, and it wasn't long before they were much faster than the Intel competition, with AMD's brand new Athlon CPUs holding a commanding lead over their Intel counterparts, as we can see here over at Anantech, whether in business applications or in gaming, with leads of up to 50% over the Pentium 3s. With no need for a conclusion here, because the benchmarks speak for themselves. The Athlon is the fastest desktop x86 processor on the market, and there is nothing in Intel's current family of processors that can match the performance of the Athlon, and even the forthcoming Coppermine will have trouble competing against AMD's latest flagship. Now, as you might imagine, this is also reflected in the stock price, with AMD hitting the heady heights of $92.25 on the 5th of May 2000. And a few years later, after AMD had launched their Opteron server CPUs, their server market share trebled in under 2 years, with the overall PC market almost flipping in favour of AMD in early 2006. But this was actually a problem, because AMD had held the CPU performance lead for around 7 years, and yet as we can see, generally hovering just over 40% market share, in no way reflected their commanding performance advantage. It was in fact back in 2000 when AMD filed another complaint accusing Intel of abusing its dominant position in the microprocessor market and violating anti-monopoly rules in Europe. And over the years, more and more cases opened up. The Japanese case, where the Japanese FTC accused Intel of illegal tactics by offering money to 5 Japanese companies. As we can see, these are all very large companies: NEC, Fujitsu, Toshiba, Sony and Hitachi. The EU case, where AMD alleges that Intel paid German retailers to sell Intel PCs only, and then the US case where the FTC accused Intel of making exclusive deals with Dell, Sony, Toshiba, Gateway and Hitachi that included cash payments, subsidies and discriminatory pricing to exclude AMD. At this time, AMD's Thomas McCoy said, "The industry problem is that computer manufacturers and retailers are under threats from retaliatory and potentially lethal price increases by Intel if they give too much business to AMD." And AMD's CEO at this time, Hector Ruiz, said, "We applaud aggressive competition, so long as it occurs on a level playing field where products can compete on the merits. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Intel uses its monopoly power to perpetuate its monopoly grip on the market, and by any standard of antitrust law, that is illegal and patently anti-consumer. Worldwide antitrust laws are clear, Abusive conduct to curb competition by a dominant monopoly is against the law. That's why we filed a lawsuit against Intel to help AMD, our industry, and consumers worldwide break free from a stranglehold that has deliberately restricted competition and slowed the pace of innovation. Now here is Intel's response to this, and pay close attention to it because at the end of this video you will see a similar response. But Intel pointed to AMD playing it safe with anemic investment in manufacturing capacity. And in addition, Intel claimed that AMD has been dogged by a reputation of being unreliable as a supplier, has traditionally lagged in innovation, and has seen products delayed well beyond original launch dates. And continuing on, Intel said it has demonstrated over a 30-year period that it can deliver faster, better, and cheaper products to consumers, in part because of its continued multi-billion-dollar investment in new capacity and research and development even during downturns in the semiconductor market. In short, AMD's colourful language and fanciful claims cannot obscure its goal of shielding the company from price competition. And now we're going to see what Intel meant by price competition. In April 2004, the Fair Trade Commission of Japan raided the offices of Intel's Japanese subsidiary and several Japanese computer companies as part of an investigation into Intel's business practices. Now, Intel's Japanese subsidiary is the IJKK, and the Japanese Fair Trade Commission required the IJKK to cease and desist its conduct which violated Section 3 of the Anti-Monopoly Act. And what the Japanese Fair Trade Commission discovered was that IJKK, since May 2002, had made the 5 major Japanese OEMs, that's this lot here that we talked about before, refrain from adopting competitors' CPUs for all or most of the PCs manufactured and sold by them, with the IJKK giving rebates and or certain funds depending on how many of AMD's CPUs they decided to use. So the largest rebates and the largest bribes would be seen in cases where the OEMs decided not to use any AMD CPUs at all, with the next step down being the OEMs using 90% Intel CPUs, with the rest of Intel's competitors having less than 10%. And option C was that they could continue to use AMD CPUs, but only in PCs with much lower volume. And based on these actions, between the years of 2003 and 2004, the share of Intel's competitors' CPUs in Japan dropped from 24% down to 11%. And these 2 years were around the time when AMD was at its most competitive against Intel, who had their awful Pentium 4 CPUs up against AMD's much superior Athlon XP and Athlon 64s. Now obviously, the Japanese FTC ruled that Intel violated Japanese antitrust laws and hurt competition in the country's processor market. Intel of course disputed the JFTC's findings, but did not contest them and agreed to refrain from certain business practices. 2 months later, AMD decided to sue Intel in the Tokyo High Court and the Tokyo District Court, seeking more than $50 million in damages arising from the chip maker's anti-competitive actions in Japan. Moving on to Korea, 2006, February the 9th, the Korean Fair Trade Commission this time raided Intel offices in South Korea, and 2 years later, the Korean FTC fined Intel 26 billion won, which was approximately $26 million, for its anti-competitive behaviour after finding the company guilty of abusing its dominant market position. Intel was disappointed with the ruling and could appeal the case. The KFTC's decision hinged on the aggressive anti-competitive rebate programs Intel employed within the Korean market. So pretty much the same as what we saw in Japan. Intel offered a total of $370 million to Samsung Electronics and Trigem Computer between 2001 and 2005 on the condition that neither company buy processors from AMD. The KFTC further found that Intel's rebate program operated on a scale that ultimately blocked AMD from competing for OEM design wins, even if the smaller company made its CPUs available for free. As Ars Technica notes, Intel thus far has met every investigation and every finding with the same "we love fair competition" reply, but unfortunately for the chipmaker, regulators around the world aren't in agreement. February the 12th, 2008, and the European Commission investigators raided Intel's office in Munich. The offices of retailers MediaMarkt and DSG International were also raided by investigators. And in May 2009, the European Commission finds Intel guilty of antitrust violations in the PC microprocessor market and fines the company $1.44 billion, saying Intel's actions harmed millions of European consumers. The main antitrust abuses involved paying rebates to system manufacturers and to Europe's largest IT retailer, MediaMarkt, in order to shut out Intel's closest rival, AMD. The European Commission's decision sets out how Intel broke EU antitrust law by engaging in two types of practices. First of all, Intel gave wholly or partially hidden rebates to computer manufacturers, including Dell, Hewlett-Packard, NEC, and Lenovo, on condition that they bought all or almost all their x86 CPUs from Intel. The exact same thing that we saw in Japan and Korea. Intel also made direct payments to Europe's largest PC retailer, Media Saturn Holding, on condition that it stocked only computers with Intel x86 CPUs. Second, Intel made direct payments to computer manufacturers, HP, Acer, Lenovo, to stop or delay the launch of specific products containing a competitor's x86 CPUs and to limit the sales channels available to those products. Intel's anti-competitive behaviour diminished competitors' ability to compete on the merits of their x86 CPUs. This resulted in a reduction of consumer choice and in lower incentives to innovate. And finally, the decision also sets out how Intel sought to conceal its practices and how computer manufacturers and Intel itself recognised the growing threat represented by the products of Intel's main competitor, AMD. Intel responded in typical fashion with a multi-page tirade on why the European Commission's Intel decision is wrong. And Intel again pointed out that they are committed to ethical business behaviour and compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Intel of course appealed the fine in the European Court, and to this day, in 2017, their appeal is ongoing. But the hits just kept on coming. Still in 2009, on November the 4th, New York Attorney General Andrew Cuomo filed a federal antitrust lawsuit against Intel in the US District Court in Delaware, alleging that the company engaged in a systematic campaign of illegal conduct to protect a monopoly. Cuomo alleged that Intel extracted exclusive agreements from large computer makers and threatened to punish those perceived to be working too closely with Intel competitors. Now, Cuomo had made public emails to, from, and about current and former Intel CEOs Paul Otellini and Craig Barrett. And he says the emails show the men discussing some of the $6 billion in quarterly payments that Intel had made to computer maker Dell from 2001 to 2006. Which Cuomo and other regulators believe were conditioned on Dell's agreement not to ship any computers powered by AMD. Now, back in 2005, when the Japan FTC had issued their formal sanctions against Intel, almost nothing of the evidence against Intel was revealed. And similarly, in 2008, when the Korean Fair Trade Commission ruled, the information that was made public was skeletal, and even when the EC hit Intel with the largest fine in its history, $1.46 billion, their 500-page written ruling, although privately shown to Intel, remained confidential at that time. So in a way, up until this point, we'd been taking all of these jurisdictions at their word, without any real evidence being made public. But as Fortune magazine says, the awful truth could not be kept at bay forever. AMD's civil case had a firm trial date approaching March the 29th, 2010, in the federal court in Delaware, and there was no way the public could be excluded from a trial. More pressing, summary judgment motions in that case were due to be filed on December the 1st, so in only a couple of weeks' time from this article, and those would inevitably refer to and append volumes of emails, internal documents, and testimony from high-level officers. Though Intel might have fought to keep those sealed, it's doubtful it could have suppressed all of them. Cracks were appearing in the dam. Now, during the European Commission's litigation, they did release hundreds of references to damning emails and internal documents, but the names of virtually every individual officer implicated had been deleted, as had almost every dollar figure mentioned in them. And the reason for that was, at this stage, the European Commission rules permit Intel and third parties, like for example Dell, to liberally excise portions they claim to be confidential. But when the European Commission released this redacted version, Intel again characterised it as biased. In a typical example of the evidence the Commission relied on, a lower-level employee of a customer company speculates that Intel might retaliate against that customer by disproportionately reducing its discounts if that customer bought or bought more from AMD. And that was basically Intel's defence up until this point. They were claiming these emails were from lower-level employees of Intel customers, speculating that Intel might retaliate. And we simply did not know. We had to take Intel's word for it because the names of all individuals had been redacted from the report. But it was that last fiction, that the European Commission case had been built on the speculations of lower-level executives, that was destined for obliteration as soon as either the Cuomo complaint or the summary judgment exhibits were filed in AMD's civil case. With the EC findings in one hand and Cuomo's answer key in the other, The public could now begin to piece together what the EC really found. In the case of Dell, for instance, Cuomo alleges, and the European Commission has already concluded, that Intel began paying large quarterly loyalty rebates to Dell in 2001, but by July 2002, many Dell customers were asking the company to make certain computer lines available with cheaper AMD chips. Dell's then Chief Operating Officer, and later CEO, Kevin Rowlands, after meeting with Intel negotiators, reported back internally that Intel was ready to do whatever it takes to keep Dell from purchasing from AMD. Initial word is that our MOAP, MOAP, the acronym stands for Mother of All Programs, which was a term used to refer to Intel's massive quarterly rebate payments to Dell, should increase from $70 million this quarter to $100 million. And if that sounds grubby to you, it's about to sound even worse. More formally, the MOAP was known as the Meat Competition Programme, but precisely how it was calculated and what it was for were things that weren't spelled out in any contract. 2003 Dell internal document describes the MCP as a monogamy tax for Intel, and explains there is not a formal contract per se that documents all the terms and conditions of the MCP programme for a quarter. And get this, rather the MCP terms and conditions are agreed upon via email and telephone communications and are finalised in a spreadsheet. And as Fortune says, $100 million per quarter and no formal contract? Indeed. Whatever these payments were for, they skyrocketed in size as Dell became increasingly tempted to stray from the Intel fold. The pressure to stray intensified after April 2003, when AMD introduced its Opteron chip for servers, which many customers saw as clearly superior to Intel's then offerings, as well as being cheaper. And worse still, due to certain misplaced bets and calculations relating to its product roadmap, Intel was not going to be able to offer a truly competitive server chip for a period of 2 to 3 years. Dell considered switching to AMD, but its executives feared the double whammy of seeing a huge chunk of its rebates not only vanish, but shifted to a competing computer maker. And by mid-2004, Intel was paying Dell about $300 million per quarter in rebates, more than 1/3 of Dell's quarterly net income. But Dell continued to lose share, revenue and reputation by not shipping the vastly superior Opteron. And on November the 4th, 2005, Intel CEO Paul Otellini reported back to his colleagues on a call that he had received from Michael Dell, Dell's then chairman, saying that Dell opened by saying, "I am tired of losing business. Dell is no longer seen as a thought leader." And later that month, Dell emailed his own people writing, "We are losing the hearts, minds and wallets of our best customers." But Otellini countered Michael Dell's complaints by reminding him, "We are transferring over $1 billion per year to Dell for MCP efforts." And as if that wasn't incriminating enough, when advised in February 2006 that Dell's then CEO Rowlands had decided to stay with Intel chips after all, Otellini emailed a colleague who was actually Intel's previous CEO, Craig Barrett, and called Rowlands the best friend money can buy. Intel's rebate payments to Dell maxed out that fiscal quarter. Between February and April 2006, at $805 million. That figure represented 104% of Dell's net income for the quarter. And as Fortune asks, do those sound like traditional volume discounts to you? Nevertheless, Dell capitulated in May and announced plans to introduce one line of AMD-powered servers, and Intel's response was cutting payments to Dell that quarter down to $554 million, which was still 116% of Dell's quarterly net. In August 2006, Dell actually started shipping AMD-powered servers, and in September it unveiled plans to introduce another AMD-powered line of PCs. And in the next quarter, the rebate dropped to $200 million. 1 week after Cuomo had filed his federal antitrust lawsuit, Intel and AMD settled all antitrust litigation and patent cross-license disputes the companies had with each other. Intel agreed to pay AMD $1.25 billion while agreeing to a set of business practice provisions and a 5-year cross-licensing agreement. In exchange, AMD agreed to drop all regulatory complaints and pending legal disputes with Intel. That was pretty much the end of it between Intel and AMD. AMD had suffered decades of litigation and abuse and had basically got to the stage where they had no money left whatsoever, and they simply could not turn down this $1.25 billion payment. Intel, on the other hand, were being severely weighed down by litigation after litigation with what looked like no end in sight. But the real thing here was, now that these emails were out showing that this was coming from the very top, a succession, in fact, of Intel CEOs involved in some pretty dubious behaviour. But the AMD and Intel settlement did not prevent other organisations from pursuing legal action against Intel. And next up, only 1 month later, was the US FTC, who filed an antitrust lawsuit against Intel, alleging that Intel has waged a systematic campaign to cut off rivals' access to the marketplace and prevent adoption of superior products produced by competitors. Intel has engaged in a deliberate campaign to hamstring competitive threats to its monopoly. It's been running roughshod over the principles of fair play and the laws protecting competition on the merits. The Commission's action today seeks to remedy the damage that Intel has done to competition, innovation, and ultimately the American consumer. And in case you're thinking this is about AMD again, Intel's latest infraction involved smothering competition to its computer processing units from Nvidia's graphics processing units by misleading and deceiving potential competitors in order to protect its monopoly. Before that, Intel threatened Dell, IBM, HP and other computer manufacturers, forcing them to choose Intel's chips over those of the competition. And when you thought Intel's crimes against competition could not get any worse, the FTC also said Intel misled computer manufacturers and consumers into thinking that its chips were faster than those of the competition. It alleges that Intel secretly redesigned its compiler software and failed to disclose that its chips only appeared faster in tests due to the differences in the compiler, as opposed to its hardware actually performing at a higher level. Writing in his blog, programming expert Agner Fogg said that it appears that Chipzilla, that's Intel, their own compiler, can produce different versions of pieces of code, with each version being optimized for a specific processor and or instruction set. The system detects which CPU it's running on and chooses the optimal code path accordingly, but it also checks what instruction sets are supported by the CPU, and it also checks the vendor ID string. If the string says genuine Intel, then it uses the optimal code path. If the CPU is not from Intel, then in most cases it will use the slowest version of the code it can find. Rather than drag this one out, Intel settled with the FTC within 1 year. The FTC settlement applies to central processing units, graphics processing units, and chipsets, and prohibits Intel from using threats, bundled prices, or other offers to exclude or hamper competition or otherwise unreasonably inhibit the sale of competitive CPUs or GPUs. The settlement also prohibits Intel from deceiving computer manufacturers about the performance of non-Intel CPUs or GPUs. But the FTC settlement also goes beyond those reached in previous antitrust cases against Intel in a number of ways. Very interestingly, the settlement order also ensures that manufacturers of complementary products, such as discrete GPUs, will be assured access to Intel's CPU for the next 6 years. Now this is 2010, so this has run out now. But what this was all about was, Nvidia feared that Intel was preparing to remove their access from PCIe. As you know, computers require a CPU. They can't even boot without a CPU. So Nvidia is heavily reliant on both Intel and AMD providing access via PCIe. But had Intel succeeded in killing off AMD, Nvidia would surely have been next in their sights. It would not be difficult for Intel to modify PCIe given the iron grip they have over the entire tech industry and effectively kill off Nvidia overnight. And here in fact we can see it. Intel are required to maintain a key interface known as the PCI Express bus for at least 6 years in a way that will not limit the performance of graphics processing chips. Intel was also ordered to disclose to software developers that Intel computer compilers discriminate between Intel chips and non-Intel chips, and that they may not register all the features of non-Intel chips. And if the developer decided to recompile the software using a non-Intel compiler, then Intel would have to reimburse all the costs of that. Around this time, Intel also paid Nvidia $1.5 billion in a settlement which ended all litigation between both companies, as well as giving Intel a licensing agreement to certain Nvidia graphics technology. Now you may think that would be it for Intel and their anti-competitive, monopolistic behaviour, but while they were less than innovative on the tech front, they were highly innovative in finding new ways to waste money while also keeping AMD down. While trying to break into the mobile market, they blew through almost $4 billion per year on this contra-revenue strategy, where effectively they just threw money at tablet manufacturers to use Intel's Bay Trail CPUs. This lasted a few years, Intel did gain some share, and as soon as the money dried up, the tablet makers went back to using the much cheaper ARM CPUs. Just another of Intel's expensive failures. However, at this time, AMD had a very competitive part, known as Mullins, which is based on the same CPU in the game consoles. When Intel started this contra revenue thing, AMD was completely cut off from that market. There is simply no way they could contend with Intel giving away their chips for free. And most recently, only 2 weeks ago in fact, Intel once again resorted to dirty marketing during their Skylake SP Xeon launch, where they revealed to certain members of the press a presentation which ended in a bunch of lies and half-truths about AMD's extremely competitive new EPYC CPUs. Once again talking about stuff like a poor track record and being an inconsistent supplier, while claiming it was Intel who had all the innovation, just like they did years ago when they claimed that AMD had been dogged by a reputation of being unreliable as a supplier and traditionally lagging in innovation and has seen products delayed well beyond original launch dates. Well, in this very long video, I have shown you the truth of what actually happened. It really all started back in the 70s and 80s when Intel reneged on their technology sharing agreement, which allowed Intel a monopoly in selling with the very popular IBM PCs. And later on, when AMD started developing its own x86 CPUs, which very soon took over the lead against Intel's anemic Pentium CPUs, Intel had phase 2 of their monopoly plan well underway. The worst thing for me in this is, most people believe that Intel is a good technology company, but for me they are an anti-technology company. If you just look at their products, they have been beaten more often than they win, and quite often released awful architectures. For example, their Itanium architecture, which was yet another attempt at gaining a monopoly and locking AMD out of servers, which backfired spectacularly as AMD developed x86-64, which of course became the new standard instead of Intel's useless Itanium. But once again, that was billions of dollars wasted. Looking at this acquisition table from 2010 onwards, billions upon billions upon billions of dollars on acquisition after acquisition that never seemed to achieve anything. Who can forget the almost $8 billion on McAfee security, almost $17 billion on Altera, and most recently $15 billion on Mobileye? Those last two, all about taking on Nvidia and artificial intelligence, something they would not have to do if they were a capable company capable of creating their own graphics. And again, stuff like contra revenue, $4 billion down the drain over multiple years. Useless architectures like Larrabee, again, billions of dollars down the drain because Intel simply could not do graphics. But undoubtedly, worst of all, the $6 billion in quarterly payments Intel made to Dell, and undoubtedly countless billions that we don't even know about. Intel often said that AMD was at maximum capacity, and that was another one of their main defences, that AMD simply could not ship any more CPUs. But had that been the case, Intel obviously wouldn't have bothered with the mother of all programs and all the rest of the bribery in every jurisdiction. But even more telling was, during all of this, obviously AMD knew that something bad was afoot. And at one point AMD tried to give HP 1 million free processors, only for HP to tell them that they were so dependent on Intel rebates that it couldn't afford to take them. Now if AMD was at maximum capacity, where did they find these 1 million free processors? What we're looking at here really is a failure of society, a failure of government, and a failure of law. Intel has simply got away with abusing the law, stretching out litigation well over a decade in some cases, by which point the rulings against Intel are woefully inadequate. Not to say the laughable fines of just over $1 billion, given how much they spent on bribes. How much money do you think Intel saved by their anti-competitive behaviour? How much money did AMD lose out on, yet were forced to settle for a miserly $1.25 billion? Because by that time, after decades of litigation, they had run out of money. This is why Intel has got away with this. People ask me why I'm down on Intel and say, you're such an AMD fanboy and you're such an Intel hater. If you have watched and understood this video, then you should certainly understand why I am down on Intel. And rather than being an AMD fanboy, I am a fanboy of technology, of innovation, and of justice and fair play, which is everything that Intel stands against. My personality dictates that I would never, ever be able to support Intel. And now that everybody is fully armed with the facts, coming to the proper decision really shouldn't be that difficult. It goes without saying that this has been a massive undertaking, a huge amount of research, which is why it's taken so long. I'll be taking a short break next week, but I should have at least one video out before then. In the meantime, be sure to check out the video description for links, both my Amazon affiliate links and also links to all of the articles I've used in this video. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later, guys.